draft for committee bill. We are live. Okay. Just got that. So this is Senate Finance, and this is February 10th. And we are going to walk through a draft that for a committee bill for anything we choose to do with the weighting study. And Senator Hardy, do you want to give us just a brief walkthrough of, I know this was you've been handling the drafting of this, so just tell us what's happening and we'll go through it.
Okay. Well, Jim has been handling the actual drafting, but I've been working closely with him. And the bill that we'll walk through, it is long. It's a complicated bill. And it includes the goals of the whole thing, the whole change to our school finance formula and system. It includes provisions to change the weights. So in the bill, the assumption is that we would go with the weights for the 4 categories of the poverty, students living in poverty, students who are in small schools of 2 kinds, students who are in population density rural areas, and grade level weights. It does not have anything at this point about ELL that we're still waiting from Senate Education. But it has the weights for the other 4 categories. We could certainly change to the cost equity formula, but that's what is in there now. It also includes some transition provisions that I mentioned yesterday about rolling in the changes in weights by averaging the equalized pupils. It includes an audit and an evaluation, which is based on the proposal that Senator Brock made to the task force, and it's fleshed out a little bit more. And it includes the creation of an education fund advisory committee, which was recommended by the tax commission and also the pupil weighting task force. And it has some provisions related to that. And it also provides additional staff to the Agency of Education. So the one thing it does do in ELL is 2 staff for ELL support, and then 2 staff for education quality standards and 2 for finance. So those are the main provisions, and Jim will go through all the details. But a lot of this is based on the recommendations of the pupil weighting task force. So that's sort of what I had Jim draft as a starting point.
Right. So this is the initial draft based just about entirely on the weighting and on the study recommendations. And Jim will walk us through it, and then it will be our turn. So Jim, why don't you start, and welcome to Senate Finance. And Jim and I started down in ed together.
We did?
And did a steep learning curve.
For me, for sure.
Oh, for me too.
So thank you, Chair Cummings. Do you prefer to have the document on screen or not?
Yeah, it's probably easiest to do it that way.
Okay, so Faith, I'm not sure if I have that capacity. Let's see. I do, great. And it's right here. Okay, so for the record, Jim Damery leads council. We are walking through this initial draft of a committee bill. And I won't go through the statement of purpose. I think Senator Hardy did an excellent job bringing out the main points. So there are 4 points brought out here, just high level around the changes to weight, around the creation of this new advisory committee, the new positions at AOE, and the requirement to have an audit performed. There's more in the bill than that, but those are some of the main parts. So coming down to the findings and goals, I won't go through these in detail. I'll just summarize what's in these subsections. So we start with Brigham, and the right to substantial equality and educational opportunity. Then we go into kind of a Vermont perspective on trying to achieve that. And then we talk about learning differences in students coming from different backgrounds and therefore needing different levels of support. And then D goes into talking about Act 173 and the weighting study that UVM and Rutgers did. And then E goes into that report that they delivered and its findings. F goes into Act 59 from last session, which created the task force that met over the summer and their recommendations. And that's it. So those are the findings and high level. The goals here, there are 5 goals, and these goals are the same goals that would be tested against during the audit. I'm going to read through these because these I think are important. So it says, by enacting this legislation, the GA intends to fulfill Vermont's constitutional mandate to ensure that all students receive substantial equality of educational opportunity throughout the state. The legislation is designed to, 1, increase educational equity by ensuring that the financial resources available to the local school districts for educating students living in poverty, students with English language learning needs, students in small rural communities, students in sparsely populated school districts, and students in middle and high schools are sufficient to meet the cost of educating these students. 2, improve educational outcomes for these students by ensuring that financial resources tied to the cost of educating these students are available to local school districts. 3, improve transparency in the distribution of financial resources to school districts by simplifying the school funding formula and better tying educational expenditures to student needs. 4, enhance educational and financial accountability by ensuring that equitable resources are budgeted and expended for the education of students in these circumstances or categories, and that regular evaluation mechanisms are utilized to assess educational equity and outcomes. And lastly, improve oversight of Vermont's K-12 public education funding system by creating the new advisory body. So those are the 5 goals. Then we go into the determination of weighted membership, kind of the heart and soul of this bill. It begins with a very technical change to the definition of long-term membership. I'll come back to that definition, but this is just merely clarifying that it's an average of 2 years enrollment, basically, and it's the current school year and the previous school year. So just clarifying which 2 years are used for that purpose. And then we have section 4. There's a couple of things. So this changes the way in which pupils from economically deprived backgrounds are identified. Now it means that people from an economically deprived background means that people who is eligible for free or reduced price lunch under the National School Lunch Act and the Child Nutrition Act. It also takes out, in the past, English language learners were counted in poverty for purposes of the poverty weighting. And this changes that to take that out. So ELL would be dealt with on its own, not through adding that into the poverty weight. Then section 5 is a piece of session law, and it's relating to the previous session around how you determine whether students are from economically deprived backgrounds. And this says it's the intention of the General Assembly that this determination be changed from what you just changed it to, which is free or reduced price school meals, to a measurement determined by the General Assembly, but not lower than 185% of the 2021 federal poverty level, with data collected from a universal income declaration form. And this goes on to explain that that form is used by various states and some school districts in Vermont to collect household size and income information, and that it reduces stigma and is a more accurate collection of information. And it requires the agency to convene a working group to develop a new form with input from school staff and hunger and nutrition experts. And that would have to be in place for the 23-24 school year. Okay, now we get into the very long and complex section on how weighted membership is determined. So before we go through this section, I just want to spend a minute, if I could, framing the process, because I know you've heard this from Brad James and others, but it's complicated. So this basically works as a recipe, a very complex recipe, and it's very step-based as we go through it. But let me just say at the beginning, just to outline the broad process. It starts with current enrollment. So every year, enrollment is measured in schools at the beginning of the year. It's called average daily membership, and it's a measure of enrollment. And so what happens then is that you average that average daily membership or enrollment over 2 years. And we just saw that definition earlier. So we now have something called long-term membership. So long-term membership is simply 2 years worth of enrollment averaged. Okay, that long-term membership, that figure is then weighted. So now we're adding weights to that figure. And there are a number of steps to do that. And then the equalization ratio is applied, which is very confusing, but I'll explain. And then you come out to your equalized pupils, which is the driver, of course, for your tax rates. So just very broadly, by way of example, let's assume a school district has long-term membership of 900 students. That's the average for 2 years of enrollment. They do their weights, and when they're all done, their weights, they have then weighted long-term membership of 1,000. So they gained 100 students through the weights. Then after that, the equalization ratio is applied. And what that ratio is, it's a statewide enrollment. So let's say we have 78,000 students statewide. Then you divide that figure by the statewide weighted enrollment. So you combine all the weights across all districts. So let's say there's 78,000 students, but the weighted statewide is 85,000. You take 78,000 divided by 85,000, and you come to 0.92. So what happens with the equalization ratio is the school district, in my example, had 900 students, but 1,000 weighted students. The 1,000 weighted students would be multiplied by 0.92, and therefore the school district would have 920 equalized pupils. And it's the equalization ratio that causes the system to, you can only gain weights by other districts losing weights. It's a zero-sum game, and that's the effect of that equalization ratio. So I know that's confusing, but I just wanted to give a high level of how the process works, and then we'll go through it in detail. So the first part of the process is the determination of average daily membership and subgroup lists. So this says that on or before the first day of December during each school year, the secretary shall determine the average daily membership as defined of each school district for the current school year. So that's the current enrollment figure, basically, so far. The determination shall list separately because these categories will be weighted, so they have to be identified first. They're going to list separately resident pupils in pre-K, resident pupils in K through grade 5, resident pupils in grade 6 through grade 8, and resident pupils in grades 9 through 12. And then on or before the first day of December during each school year, the Secretary shall identify resident pupils from economically deprived backgrounds as defined, we went through the definition earlier, in each school district for the current school year. And then on before that day again, the Secretary shall list all school districts that have a population density measured by the number of persons per square mile residing within the geographic boundaries of the district as of July 1 of that year, equaling fewer than 36 persons per square mile, or 36 to 54 persons per square mile, or 55 to 100 persons per square mile. Population density data shall be based on the most recent U.S. Census data as provided to the Agency of Education by the Vermont Center for Geographic Information. And then again, by that same date, the first day of December, Secretary shall list all school districts that have one or more schools that have an average 2-year enrollment of fewer than 100 enrolled pupils or 100 to 250 enrolled pupils. And then there's a certain way that enrollment is counted in terms of the small schools. And it's here, it's very technical. It means the average enrollment of the 2 most recently completed school years, and means the number of pupils who are enrolled in a school operated by the district on October 1st, and a pupil should be counted as 1, whether the pupil is enrolled as a full-time or part-time student. That's very confusing, but that is how it works now for small school grants. So it's carried over from that, and it's how Brad James computes this. So that's why this is here. Okay, so to lay the groundwork again. So far we've identified average daily membership, and we sorted it into all these categories that we're going to need to weight. And now the second step of the process is the determination of long-term membership. And again, that is just a 2-year average of average daily membership. The Secretary shall determine long-term membership for each school district for each pupil group described above. So pupil groups, again, are the ones we talked about in terms of like pre-K and etc., all those different groups. The third step is to determine weighted long-term membership. So now we're applying the weights to long-term membership. So we're applying weights to the 2-year average enrollment. The Secretary shall determine the weighted long-term membership for each school district. And there are a number of steps here. So first, the Secretary shall first apply grade level weights. Each pupil included in long-term membership shall count as 1, multiplied by the following amount. So this will be a little confusing because we have a negative, but so the way this is going to work is we're going to accumulate all these weights and then add the cumulative weights to the count of 1. Okay, it's a cumulative process, and you're adding weights to a count of 1. So it'll be 1 plus something. Except that we have a negative weight, which is we have a negative weight of 0.54 because the weight for pre-K student is 0.46. And under this methodology, you have to subtract this to get to that 0.46. So that's a little confusing, but that's how that works. And then grades 6 through 8, much more straightforward. You have a weight of 0.36. So for example, if you're a student in grade 6, from this you have a weight so far of 1.36. And then grades 9 through 12, you have a weight of 0.39. Then, so that applies to grade level weights. Now we're going to move to weights for the economically deprived background students. So each people included in long-term membership so receive an additional weight of 1.03. So if you're from economically deprived background, you're getting an additional weight of 1.03 in addition to your count of 1. And then third, the secretary shall then apply the weight for people living in low population density school districts. So each people included in long-term membership residing in a low population density school district shall receive an additional weighting amount of 0.15, where the number of persons per square mile in the school district is 35 or fewer, and 0.12, where the number of persons per square mile in the school district is 36 or more, but fewer than 56, or 0.07, where the number of persons per square mile in the school district is 56 or more, but fewer than 101. And then lastly, the secretary will apply a weight for pupils who attend a small school. That is conditional though. So if the number of persons per square mile in a school district is 55 or fewer, and the school district has a small school, they'll get this weight, but you have to meet both conditions. You have to be in a sparsely populated school district as well. And that weight is if there are fewer than 100 pupils, then the school district receives an additional weighting amount of 0.21 for each pupil included in the small school's average 2-year enrollment, or if it's 100 or more but fewer than 251 pupils, then it's an additional weight of 0.07 of those students enrolled in the small school. And then 5 says a school district's weighted long-term membership shall equal long-term membership plus the accumulation of the weights assigned by the secretary under the subsection. So this is 5 is where we're saying all of this stuff accumulates. So you have a count of 1 because you've got long-term membership will be your count of 1 for each student. And then you're going to accumulate all those weights, and you have 1 minus weight for the pre-K. Everything else is a positive weight. Then we go to no change here. There's a hold harmless provision. So we did take out some language here, but again, it's just taking out the old weighting methodology. For F is hold harmless. This is where you have a 3.5% hold harmless. So you have a decline of students year over year. You'll be protected, so your tax rate won't go up too much. That stays, but you'll see later on that this is in the transitional provision. This is suspended for 5 years during the transition. And then lastly, H, the secretary then determines equalized pupils. And again, that when she does that, or the secretary does that, it is to take that weighted long-term membership of the school district and multiply by the equalization ratio that I described, and that will get you to equalized pupils. So that is that section, which is very complicated. Let me pause there, maybe.
I have to get down by the golf course, by the carts.
Michael, you're not muted.
Should I continue, or I just wanted to give the committee a chance to raise questions, or no? Okay. Okay, so I'll continue. So 6A is a amendment to what we just went through, which is, and that's because this amendment takes effect in the future. So you'll see there on that as a transitional mechanism for 5 years, equalized pupils is averaged in the first couple of years, is averaged over a 5-year period. and then it reduces to averaging over a 2-year period. So the transitional period has an average to smooth out the rolling in of these new weights. But once that process is over, I believe it's in 2028, this says that going forward, the equalized people count will be the average of the current year in the last 2 years. So it'll be a 3-year average. So going forward today, equalized people count was a 1-year figure, and going forward after the transition, it will be a 3-year average rather than a 1-year figure. And that's what this does. And then there is this section 6B called Prospective and Conditional Repeals, which is session law, which reads, if on or before July 1, 2027, the General Assembly has not revised the weighting factors to reflect changes in cost factors from which the weights are derived, after receiving a recommendation of the new advisory committee to do so, then the weighting section we just went through is repealed, and in that section 6A, which again is an amendment to the weighting section, is repealed. So this is kind of a measure to encourage the General Assembly to take action in the future, either by adjusting the weights or not. But if they're not going to do that, they have to repeal this provision right here, 6B, so that the weighting section won't be repealed. So it's going to force some action in the future. I
Jim,
believe.
is this similar to if we do not set a yield, used to be a tax rate, it reverted to the original tax rate and whatever the corresponding yield was of $1.10?
Well, I'm not sure because I'm not that close to the yield, but what this is similar to in my mind is the education fund statute, which says that there's permitted uses for the education fund, but the very last provision says if the fund is used for other purposes, the whole education tax system basically is right. So this is more similar in that in terms of forcing a notwithstanding clause in that case. In this case, it will force some action to be taken either by changing the weights or repealing this section 6B.
So if we don't update the rates, then it reverts, all of this goes away and it reverts to the original weights?
No, the weights go away entirely. So you have to do.
There's no weighting. Okay.
Yeah. So you have to change, basically just take out 6B. So you could just repeal this section 6B and you'd be back to where you were. So it's either do the weights or repeal or repeal this, basically. So
and I assume we would have to act if we wanted to continue the rates as they are.
this would, because this would, yeah, you have to act, because otherwise, if you didn't
It would
update
go
the
away.
weights, the whole thing would go away. Yeah.
We'd have to reauthorize. All right.
And Madam Chair, if I may, one of the reasons this is in here is because the original weighting factors report by Professor Colby and her team recommended that the weights be updated every 5 years, at least every 5 years. And so this would be, if we enact this in 2022, 2027 would be 5 years. And so it sort of forces a recalculation of the weights and could recalculate them to be the same thing or something different. So that's why this is in here.
Okay.
Okay.
Any
Okay.
other questions? I can't see anybody, so you have to holler. All right.
Okay. All right. So now we're going into section 7. So now we're talking about merger support, or what used to be called small school support. So what this does, now that there is this small school weight, this repeals essentially the small school support statute, except that it turns it into a merger support statute, because we do have merger support for those districts that voluntarily or involuntarily merged. So it takes out the current language, but puts in new language, which I'll come to momentarily. So now it says that a school district that was voluntarily formed under Act 46, etc., and receives a merger support grant shall continue to receive that merger support grant subject to the provisions of subsection C. And what that will say is that if you get a weight, a small school weight, you don't get the merger support grant too. And then same thing here in B, if you're involuntarily merged or formed by the state board, again, you get the same deal basically. So you're gonna get the merger support grant. It's the same. Basically, you're gonna take your small school grant that you had in fiscal 2020, and that will become a merger support grant going forward, the same amount, but you don't get that again if you get a small school weight, which is right here, and C. And then, of course, the merger support grants go away if the small school is closed. If the reason for getting that grant changes, because the small school closes, then you no longer get the grant. And then there's just some technical changes here. So we have section 8 around DAS missions and corrections. And this is just taking out the reference to small school support since that's gone. And again, another conforming change here, talking about the small school weighting adjustment rather than the small school grant. So these are merely conforming. Now we go into the transitional section 10. And so what this says is that for fiscal years 24, 25, 26, so the first 3 years, I believe, the number of equalized pupils in a school district should be determined by averaging the equalized pupil count for the year of calculation with equalized pupil counts for the preceding 4 fiscal years. So for these 3 years, you're taking a 5-year average of your equalized pupil counts. And then for the next year, you're taking a 4-year average. And then for the next year, 28, you're taking a 3-year average. And then after that, we went over earlier that you're amending the base statute to have a 3-year average going forward after fiscal year 28. Then section 11 suspends the excess spending penalty for that same 5-year period, the transitional period. And it also suspends that hold harmless provision, that 3.5% hold harmless we talked about is also suspended during that 5-year transitional period. Section 12 is a piece of session law, which just says that the Vermont Center for Geographic Information will work with the agency to help them determine number of persons per square mile. And then we go into evaluation and reporting. So I'm going to read through this section, but not the goals again, which are repeated here. But it says on or before December 15, 2029, the state auditor shall submit to the House and Senate Committees on Education, Ways and Means, Finance, Agency of Education, and the new Education Tax Advisory Committee a performance audit conducted under GAAP. Government accepted, generally, is that GAAP? That's government. So that identifies the successes and failures of the implementation of this act, including whether and to what extent each of the Act's 5 goals have been met, which are 2, and this just repeats those 5 goals that we went through at the beginning. But this is the testing, what's being tested against. And then it says if a goal has not been met, the reasons why and recommendations to achieve that goal, and the fiscal impact of the act, including the cost of implementation. This is the audit should be carried out by the state auditor or a contracted designee of the state auditor who, in order to maintain independence, has not consulted on or contracted to provide services in relation to the people weighting factors report, or the report prepared under Act 59. And the audit should cover the period beginning July 1, 2024 and ending on June 30, 2029. And then the audit should take into account such metrics as the auditor determines appropriate, which shall include EQS, so how the school's doing on EQS, and looking at various metrics for that. Student performance, progress on proficiency-based learning assessments and graduation requirements, student performance on standardized tests, the Vermont Youth Behavior Risk Surveys results, graduation and post-secondary education enrollment rates, education spending, homestead tax rates, educator compensation levels and for licensure status, and academic, extracurricular, and student support resources across school districts. Then we have the creation of this Education Fund Advisory Committee. And the purpose is to monitor Vermont's education financing system, conduct analyses, recalculate and recalibrate the people weights and categorical aid amounts as necessary, and make annual recommendations, reporting annual recommendations, and so report its findings to the General Assembly. Membership should be 7 members, Commissioner of Taxes, Secretary of Education or designees, 2 members of the public with expertise in education financing, appointed by the Speaker, 2 members of the public with expertise in education financing, appointed by the Committee on Committees, and 1 member of the public with expertise in education financing, appointed by the Governor. Powers and duties are annually on before January 15th of each year. The Committee should make recommendations to you regarding the recalculation and recalibration of pupil weights and categorical aid as necessary, the property dollar equivalent yield, the income dollar equivalent yield, the non-stead property tax rate, and the amount of the stabilization reserve. Assistance is from various people or departments of taxes, AOE, GFO, Ledge Council, and Office of Ledge Operations, and then standard language around meetings, compensation, the standard compensation as well. And then it requires a first report of this committee by January 15th of next year. Yeah, so that's basically it there. And then section 16 is a change to the tax title, section title 32. And this changes existing law. And so now it will read annually, not later than December 1, the Education Fund Advisory Committee, rather than the Commissioner of Taxes, after consultation with the JFO, shall calculate and recommend a property dollar equivalent yield, income dollar equivalent yield, non-homestead tax rate. And then it also says that annually before December 1, the committee with the assistance of JFO should prepare and publish the Education Fund Outlook. Those are the only changes to that section of tax law. Then we have the section that requires collaboration by the agency in JFO. So it says that they will, before August 1 this year, enter into a memorandum of understanding to share data, models, and other information that's needed to update the weighting factors, host the statistical model used to provide modeling, and keep and maintain that on both systems in parallel, and then recommend, based on their consensus view, we calibrate weights to the Education Fund Advisory Committee. Then we come to staffing at the AOE. So this creates 6 positions. 2 positions to provide support for English language learners, 2 for education quality standards to support that, and 2 to support the new committee. The appropriation of 600,000 I put in as a guesstimate, 100,000 per. I'm sure the agency would have views on that figure. Then we come to technical and conforming changes, the task force realized over the summer that the excess spending provision has some provisions that aren't used, so they're being taken out. So when you're determining excess spending, you exclude various categories, and so these are categories of exclusions that aren't being used. So the first one is spending attributable to the cost of planning the merger of a small school, which has a grade size of 20 or fewer students. I don't think there are schools in the state like that anymore, or I think the agency doesn't believe that, so that's why that's being taken out. And then school district costs associated with dual enrollment, early college, those aren't paid by the school district, those are paid by the state, so that really shouldn't be here. Then we're section 20, we're amending equalized pupils. This is just simply a technical change because you have to calculate equalized pupils in a given year, but then we're going to be using a 3-year average of that going forward. So I'm just clarifying that that this definition is one that is used when you're calculating for any given year. So that's the change there. And then this provision 20, section 21 is the power of school boards. And so has this change here. It's basically cross-referencing the weights again. So the new weighting language we've got. And then we have effective dates, and these basically the core of this bill takes effect, if you will. I'm going to skip down to B on July 1 of next year. That's all the weighting changes that we're talking about. So the ones coming to effect on passage are the findings, the goals, the requirement to develop a universal income declaration form, the requirement to the new education advisory committee, etc. So you have a bunch of things taking effect on passage, things taking effect a year out, and then finally that provision 6A taking effect in 2028, and that's the one that changes the definition to use the 3-year average as opposed to 1 year. So that is the end of your walkthrough.
Okay.
Let me take this down so you can.
Yeah, committee. Let me. Okay. The one change I noticed that we hadn't talked about was having this committee do what's now called the November 1st letter with the recommended yields. I want to send the whole bill out, I think, to the education department and to the tax department and joint fiscal for comment or feedback, because that is a change. And that committee is set up to recommend weights every year.
Back to
Every 5 years.
sorry, Chair. I'm looking for that provision. I want to make sure I get it right for you.
Get back to us. It was right at the end. It talked
Yeah,
about, are they assessing weights every year?
the yeah, where's the report?
Okay, you can get, just.
Yeah,
drop
let me
Yeah.
let me check. Yeah,
Okay,
I'll check.
and this calculates everything as a weight. Is that correct?
Correct.
And we're leaving, but the ELL weight is, we're still waiting, right? There's a big red square that we will plug Ed into. But we have not talked about, one of the original thoughts was that we could do some as weights and some as grants outside of ELL. And what's concerning me, and I've got to do more research, is that I have an inner city that is losing, that is one of my lowest spending, poorest districts, and one of my larger, not definitely wealthier than the inner city school is gaining. And a lot of it, and the difference is the sparsity weights. And I'm wondering how many other inner cities, because they are dense, are actually losing. These are the places that thought they were going to win. And I want to check on that, but I'm wondering if we went to because we already, for rural schools, they get a transportation grant. Now we're waiting them for poverty. There's also a small school grant up to schools having 250 students, which is not too small in Vermont. So we've got 3, and I've asked Professor Colby to come in and talk to us why we also need a rurality, sparsity, lack of density grant if we are covering for the cost of transportation and poverty and ELL and other things. But it seems to be the density, that's the weight that's working against the inner cities. And I just haven't had time to sit down and go through all of Brad's printouts from yesterday. But I asked about my 2 schools, and it was the density weight that threw them. Senator Brock.
I would just amplify what you said in the discussion with Professor Colby coming up as to whether the density rate is a measure in itself or whether the way it appears in the ultimate statistics that she came up with, in effect, a measure of other factors of which density just happens to be commonality. For example, in rural districts, poorer, our rural districts have other factors that may have influenced this particular weight or the application of this weight, and is rurality an equally valid measure of something that is meaningful, whereas poverty is much more clear cut. And I think it's worth exploring more in our questioning of Professor Colby, because it's something, frankly, that's concerned me as a member of the task force.
So that's just one that I've picked up on, and I want to have a little more discussion. And I finally figured out, I haven't heard much from my districts, but I have 2 superintendents that were appointed in the last 2 weeks, one as recently as last night. And I'm not sure, I know there's been some churning in the superintendency, there's been interims, and I'm not sure where they are, but I don't think if they have a full-time superintendent now, it's not a very long-term one. So but I know that these are schools that thought they are so poor and they weren't when the weights got put in originally, that they were going to see something of a windfall, and they are actually going to lose, depending on where and lose 92 students, which is not a small amount. So that's just one of the things I want to look at. But we've looked at weights, we've decided we were leaning towards weights rather than the equity payments, but we haven't really looked at the interaction and if we might either not do something or do something as a grant, which would take it out of that whole weighting profile. So just a thought there, but you might want to look at some, if you've got any inner city. I know we looked at Bennington. I think I wanted to look at St. Johnsbury. St. Albans, I think, is probably transferred enough to, it might still be impacted, but some of those smaller, denser communities. And then some of them have private academies that act as public schools. So that gets even more complicated. Okay, questions at this point? I'm starting to think there's a conspiracy to get a long break. Senator Bray.
So I don't remember the sequence in terms of the factors used in the weighting study group. I mean, did Professors can you just remind me, did Professor Colby's report get drafted prior to your ever convening, and then you're reviewing that? And so this whole rurality measure had already been introduced into the mix, or was it something that evolved out of your committee conversations?
Okay, that's a question for Senator Hardy, I assume.
Yeah. So do you want me to answer that, Senator?
Please.
Okay. The original pupil weighting factors report that was produced by Professor Colby and her team came out in December of 2019, and it included a set of weights for the 5 categories under current discussion. So students living in poverty, students in different grade levels, middle school and high school, students in small schools, and ELL students, and then students who lived in low population density areas. And the population density has 3 different levels of population density, and the small schools has 2 different levels of small schools. And those were all in Professor Colby's team's original report. And she and her team did a lot of statistical analysis based on 10 years. I think it was 2010 to 2019 cost data for school districts and schools and regions, the region, looking at that cost data and doing statistical analysis to determine how much more educating a student in those various circumstances cost to the same standard, and that standard was test scores. So the quick answer to your question is yes, those were the original categories that Professor Colby's team proposed. We did not change those categories at all. We had a lot of discussions about them, as I've talked to Senator Cummings about, and Senator Brock can confirm or deny, I suppose, this, but we had a lot of conversations about whether or not we thought that all 3 of those rural categories were necessary, and did transportation offset it. And Professor Colby can talk to that issue. She talked to us about it. We had conversations about the different grade levels. We had conversations about the different school sizes. And as Senator Cummings said, a lot of us were skeptical that a 250 person school was small in the context of Vermont. But Professor Colby's data showed that there were differences in costs for these categories. And I would assume that she would say that the other things were held constant. So poverty was held constant when looking at rurality, et cetera. But I can't speak for her. I'd rather have her explain it. But
No,
they
we're inviting
are
her
the
back in.
same categories that were in the original report.
And if I may, just to follow up, so costs, I mean, if the idea is to measure costs, then you would also want to know that you're getting the same outcomes for that cost, like the educational quality or whatever product is the same in each place so that the costs are also comparable. And so you're saying she normalized on test scores, that was the proxy for an equally valuable education?
Her outcome, the outcome they used was math and English language, English test score, math and reading test scores. So they looked at the standardized tests for students in each district and said, if this student got I'm going to make up levels, but 100, and they are this kind of student, how much more would it cost to educate this student to get up to the 100? So that sort of differential was what was used to determine the weights. And this is a very oversimplification of it, but that's how it is done sort of in the background. And so behind each weight is a cost factor. And those cost factors are actually what is the cost equity payments are those cost factors. Mm-hmm. So if you remember the chart that I gave all of you that had, these are the weights, these are the cost factors. Mm-hmm. Literally that the weight that's the cost that's associated with that weight to educate the same student up to an equitable standard. And I guess you could say the sort of like average student is a student in elementary school that is not impoverished, does not go to a small school, does not live in a sparsely populated area, does not have English language learner needs. So that the one is the elementary school student in those circumstances. And so how much does it take to educate everyone else up to that same standard? And knowing that educating middle schoolers and high schoolers is more expensive, namely because of the wider variety of classes and services that are necessary.
Okay. But this is all based on the assumption that if I spent 2 point whatever, if you've got the 1 and your weight is 1.24, that if I spent twice as much, 2.25 times as much, I could educate that poor student to the wealthy student's level based.
Essentially, I mean, and I really, Professor Cole, it's her research, so I don't want to.
So I think, we'd talk about that.
Explain it. But we did have these conversations, and there was skepticism expressed and concerns and questions, about some of the weights, and ultimately the task force kept the same categories that she had in her team had in their original report, mainly because we didn't have any sort of counterfactual data to say that's not right. And theirs was an empirical study that came up with these. A different empirical study would certainly come up with different results. That's how it works. But
okay. Did I see somebody before Senator Brock? Senator Pearson, did you have your hand up?
I was just going to comment that, the details of language seem a little in the future to me, that so that's why I wasn't engaging in questions.
Oh, okay. Senator Brock.
There's just a comment on where there may be some skepticism. When Professor Colby first came before the task force, I noticed that she emphasized that her work was based upon what the legislature asked her to do. And in a subsequent meeting, I went back to her and said, what I heard was that you did what we told you to do, but the question is, did you do what should have been done? and I didn't really come away, and Senator Hardy may have a different opinion. I didn't really come away, having come back to that question 2 or 3 times during the weeks we did this. I didn't come back with a real clear answer on that. And so that is always been kind of in the back of my mind is, did we do everything that should have been done? And did we use everything that perhaps we should have looked at? Or were we narrowly focused on these particular areas of inquiry? I think that what was done, I think was done well. I think was done thoroughly. I think I'm comfortable with the kind of methodology that Professor Colby used. I also, of course, obviously look at the end result. We have what, a 66-page bill. And I guess the only thing that we should have added is a coefficient of complexity to make it a little bit more difficult to understand. But aside from that, I think we did what we could with what we had.
Yeah. And I think that given what we asked the task force to do, they did way more than we asked them to do. But our primary goal was equity. And we knew the old weights weren't equitable. We knew that towns had changed and people had migrated, and towns that once were fairly middle class, the jobs have gone away and they aren't that middle class anymore. But now we're doing the runs. And when you look at the impact and something seems counterintuitive, I think it's time, I just feel the need to understand why, because I'm going to get asked why. And, if Washington County may be different in that we do have a couple of small cities. But I want to make sure that we aren't disadvantaging another group of kids in trying to advantage kids in more rural communities, because there are some very wealthy rural communities. And I think we just need to take a look and make sure that what we've done fits. When we look at the reality of how it plays out, just see if that fits with how we thought it was going to come out with the reality on the ground. And if it doesn't, ask why, at least so we understand that. Senator Hardy.
Yeah, a couple of things. The rural cost difference that Professor Colby pointed to, and she'll have more details on this, is that the cost of labor and the cost of supplies are higher in rural areas in some cases, and our rural school districts don't have sufficient funds to pay that same cost. And I think you heard that from Superintendent Batso-Jorn talking about how she has a whole bunch of teachers who aren't fully licensed because she doesn't have enough resources to pay for the licensed teachers. So that's one thing about the rural things. And then there are districts that sort of get caught in the middle that are neither wealthy nor really poor. And that's certainly true for Addison County. We get caught in the middle. And I think it's somewhat true for Washington County, just sort of looking through that, the run that Brad did. And one thing about Barry, and this is true for Addison County District, did Barry merge, Senator Cummings?
Yes.
So the districts that merged.
It was a forced merger.
Right. So because they're larger, their poverty, the sort of poverty in maybe inner city Barry gets less, overall is lower. And then also their density is lower. So districts like that, that's true for a couple of my districts as well. And that's one of the main reasons why we kept the merger support grants. For those districts, they would continue to get the merger support grants. And that is not in the printout that Brad did. So we could ask him to add those in so you can sort of see the extra that they would continue to get for merger support grants. So that was definitely a factor because they wouldn't get the weight they did what
And
we
they
asked.
are, yeah, they are getting the merger. To
Yeah.
make it more complicated locally, Barrytown just did a reappraisal. And one tax bill I'm very acquainted with went up 40%. And it usually takes at least two, it took 3 votes to pass a budget. And if their wealthier areas taxes went up anywhere near that, it's going to be a very interesting town meeting in Barry, or the merged school district. And it's just, it's the perfect storm at this point. So I just want to make sure we've dotted our I's and crossed our T's, and know why whatever is happening is happening. So, okay, any other questions, comments? All right, we are ahead of schedule. We are not, our next witness is not scheduled until 3:15, right? Because we thought this would go until 3, and it hasn't.
Madam Chair, can I just
Yes.
ask? I'm just wondering, given the silence, what other members of the committee might need to hear in order to go to the next step with this?
I think we may need to start with, see if we can get some breakouts on the ed fund impact of that rotating or averaging per pupil. I'm assuming you guys didn't do that. The averaging, the
transition?
5-year average, the transition.
Yeah, I can talk to Brad about that.
Well, we'll drop Brad a note and see if
Yeah.
he can come in and help us see how that would work on the ed fund. And get a sense of how that might work. The other thing we've done is say your tax rate, to stabilize how much that can go up. But I think the per pupil, which is what we're changing, we're going to want to transition in. And we have got somebody from the pupil weights, from the director of the Coalition of Vermont Student Equity is coming in, and at 3:15. And after that, we are going back to S53. Bill Driscoll is here from AIV. We've asked for some testimony from what could be affected industries. Apparently there was a CPA that spoke for the chamber in the House. Megan Sullivan from the chamber, that CPA has moved on, and she's trying to find somebody else to come in and talk to us from the chamber, and see how that works on that one. And then we're going to walk through S-166, which is a new bill. So that's the rest of the afternoon.
Are we still anticipating some guidance from Senate Ed at this point on pupil weighting?
We are anticipating a proposal on the English language, yes. And I know they're trying to get it out. We had a touch base this morning. And I think they're looking at trying to get it out early next week. I know they couldn't get it out tomorrow, but they're trying, and as soon as we get that, we can plug that in. Then we can look at then we know we're dealing with the runs with at least that. We can, I think, eliminate one run, and then one column in there, and still work our way through, but we will be able to see what the impact of that decision is.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
you've repeatedly stated that we would just accept Senate Ed's recommendation as gospel. And I really want to just say I don't accept it as gospel. I will be very, very appreciative of their work and obviously consider it, but I'm not sure why we would just sort of hand over our power in this case. But
I
obviously
usually,
their input is not anything I would dismiss, but
no. I usually, when a bill comes to us, try and keep our focus on sections of the bill which are within our jurisdiction. Jurisdiction has been given to the Ed Committee to work this one through. I've been in this building long enough to know that there are no sacred cows and that we can cut up anything we feel like. And I also know that anything we do will be chopped and reassembled in the other body. This is sausage making at its finest. I think it's wishful thinking that you will just do that so we can get this bill out of here. But I also know that you might not. So, but they are getting the first cut at it, and they might do what you think is the right thing, and life might be good, or life might get a lot more interesting. So we will see. Senator Hardy, did you have something to say?
I not on that. You've said
Good.
said it all. But I just wanted to make a request to Senator Brock, because in the section on the audit, you'll see that as I said, put a lot more meat on the bones of that, and just want you to make sure I know you do this anyway, but please look through it, and maybe we should have the auditors and obviously AOE and people like that.
Yeah, I think I'm going to ship this bill out to all the impacted state agencies and just ask them if they would like to comment, because we've switched responsibility, we've added responsibility. Having been through this before, I think telling the administration they will add 6 positions probably won't get warmly received, and it will send this bill to appropriations.
Yeah,
But,
I mean, but that's something.
We also heard from the
We heard
superintendents.
really clearly about how school districts need more support from AOE.
Yeah.
And also to Senator Brock's point about the sort of narrowness of the study and that question that he asked, I think at least 5 times of Professor Colby about what would you do if you were going to redesign the whole thing. That the audit is partly sort of trying to get at that question.
Right.
So wanting to make sure the timing of it, Jim and I went around and around on the timing of it. So that's another thing to make sure that we've got it at the right time. So,
but it's important that we do this right, because this is going to be a major change. There will be some major change in some of our districts, which means we will feel major pain. Some of us are still healing from the merger debates. And so you don't, when you do something this major, you can tweak it, but you don't want to be doing something major in the next year or two. So I think it behooves us to make sure we've got it right. Senator Brock.
Well, I think we did what we could with what we had, but part of the underlying thought behind the questions that I kept repeatedly asking Professor Colby and others were, if you were to design a really workable education funding system, would it look like this?
Well, no.
It wouldn't. It probably wouldn't, but we didn't get there. We didn't get
no. Well, that
there.
isn't what we asked her to do or paid her to do.
That's correct. We did not. And so we got what we asked for.
Yep.
And now we've got to deal with it.
So we are, yes, we are dealing with the base system we've got, and we are changing one section of it, one section that never got looked at in, I think, any of our time here in the building. Maybe Senator McDonald was here in the other body when they looked at weights, but we've never looked at them in my time in the building. Okay, so you're getting a slightly longer than scheduled break. Thank you, Jim. That is, yeah, this one and the merger bill. You've done your share of heavy drafting.
I think the worst for special education. That was tough.
Okay, I missed that one. But if you'd like to take a shot at appraisal, how you appraise timeshares, we'd love help.
Okay.
Okay, committee, I'll see you. Be here a few minutes before 3:15. And we will